Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. On Thursday afternoon, President Obama announced a framework of a deal with Iran about their nuclear program.
This framework would cut off every pathway that Iran could take to develop a nuclear weapon. Iran will face strict limitations on its program, and Iran has also agreed to the most robust and intrusive inspections and transparency regime ever negotiated for any nuclear program in history. So this deal is not based on trust. It's based on unprecedented verification. Many key details will be finalized over the next 3 months, and nothing is agreed to until everything is agreed.
Now joining us to discuss what we know so far about the details of the framework agreement is Robert Kelley. He joins us from Europe. Robert's a former nuclear weapons analyst at Los Alamos National Laboratory and a former director at the IAEA. He's also now an associate research fellow at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Thanks very much for joining us, Bob.
Good evening, Paul.
So there's a document that was released just prior to President Obama's statement. It's called The Parameters for a Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action Regarding the Islamic Republic of Iran's Nuclear Program. It's fairly detailed what this framework agreement is. And before we work our way through the details, because we're going to get pretty detailed here, just give me your overall impression.
Well, I've had a chance to read through it, and I listened to the president's speech. I was very pleasantly surprised how much detail there is there, how specific the plans are, and how effective it looks like the program they're putting together is. I really wasn't expecting this, particularly given all the dithering that's gone on this week.
Okay, so we're going to work through the details, and I guess the question is, if you're looking at it through the framework, at least of how the Americans and their allies look at it, the question is this, if these measures are lived up to, does it achieve what they say they want to achieve, which is Iran will not have the capacity for making a bomb, or the breakout capacity will be significantly delayed. If you're looking at this through the Iranian framing, I think they're probably saying, we never said we had we always said we didn't have a nuclear program, and this, nuclear weapon, I should say, yeah, excuse me. And the fact that we're agreeing to this framework is kind of evidence that that wasn't our intent anyway. At any rate, let's work our way through what's been agreed to. So starting on the first issue in this statement of facts is under the topic enrichment. Iran has agreed to reduce by approximately 2/3 its installed centrifuges. Iran will go from having about 19,000 installed today to 6,104 installed under the deal, with only 5,060 of these enriching uranium I'll repeat that. With only 5,060 of these enriching uranium for 10 years. All 6,104 centrifuges will be IR-1s, Iran's first generation centrifuge. So what does all that mean, and how significant is it?
Well, I think it's very significant. The fact that they're going to be IR-1s, which is a completely obsolete technology, says they're going to remain back in the late 20th century in terms of their technology. They've reduced the numbers considerably. They'll produce very little material. They've agreed to limit it to 3.6%. I believe they've also said they will either dilute down much of their product or ship it overseas for sale. So I think they've made some very significant concessions there.
Another thing that's mentioned, all excess centrifuges and enrichment infrastructures will be placed in IAEA monitored storage and will be used only as replacements for operating centrifuges and equipment. Significant?
Yes, that's very straightforward. You find a warehouse that you realize has so many doors, you seal the doors, the IAEA knows what went in, they from time to time check the seals and go inside and see that things are staying the way they were. That's very straightforward. It's what's done with nuclear reactor fuel. Easy, straightforward.
Okay, another point, next point really. Iran has agreed to not build any new facilities for the purposes of enriching uranium for 15 years.
Very significant. A couple of years ago, they said they had plans to build 10 or so new facilities for enrichment. It was obviously an empty boast, but this puts the lie to the empty boast. Very, very significant. Great. One old plant with 20th century technology. Great.
Okay, next. Iran's breakout timeline, the time that it would take for Iran to acquire enough fissile material for one weapon, is currently assessed to be 2 to 3 months. That timeline will be extended to at least 1 year for a duration of at least 10 years under this framework. I mean, first of all, do you think that 2 or 3 months thing is real? And then what's the significance of this being in the agreement?
Paul, I don't do those kind of calculations. I know who made the 2 to 3 month calculation. He's very hard over on one side of the issue. That's his business. But moving it back to 1 year, which we could probably all agree on, is a good thing.
So that 2 or 3 months might be a somewhat dubious figure to begin with.
Well, I mean, there are people doing these calculations, and some of them, you know, take the very worst cases they can think of. I think that's a very worst case. In any case, if it's going to be a year, and that's what both sides, let's remember, it's the P5+1 agreeing with Iran. If the P5+1 agrees it's 1 year, it's probably 1 year.
Right. Okay. All right. Next, this is under the category: Iran will convert its facility at Fordo so that it will no longer be used to enrich uranium. And then it goes on to say Iran will not have any fissile at Fordo for 15 years. Iran has agreed not to enrich uranium at, I'm sorry, that's redundant. Iran has agreed not to enrich uranium at its Fordo facility for at least 15 years. How significant?
Oh, extremely significant. They've taken one plant out of the equation. Other things in that paragraph say they're going to remove, I think, 2/3 of the centrifuge equipment and convert the rest of this underground facility to some other R&D. And they're going to let our IAEA come in to verify that. So it's not as if they're going to build something else in that underground facility and we won't know what it is. IAEA will be going in there. There was something in the press the last couple of days about enriching other isotopes like xenon. I couldn't find that in today's agreement.
Okay. Next, under the category, Iran will only enrich uranium at the Natanz facility with only 5,060 IR-1 first-generation centrifuges for 10 years. How significant?
Well, it's the same thing we talked about before. Those centrifuges date from the late 1960s. They're extremely poor technology. They fail quite frequently. This is Iran's saving face by saying we're going to have thousands of centrifuges operating, but they actually don't work very well. They're kind of junk. So it's a face-saving gesture on their part, and I think that the P5+1 is smart to allow them that wiggle room.
Okay, good. Next, inspections and transparency. The IAEA will have regular access to all of Iran's nuclear facilities, including to Iran's enrichment facility at Natanz and its former enrichment facility at Fordo, and including the use of the most up-to-date modern monitoring technologies. Inspectors will have access to the supply chain that supports Iran's nuclear program. The new transparency and inspections mechanisms will closely monitor materials and/or components to prevent diversion to a secret program. How significant?
Well, again, I think that's very significant, and that was one of the very pleasant surprises for me in this. You always worry about a parallel secret program. Of course, the parallel secret program would have to have mining and conversion, production of hexafluoride, enrichment, centrifuge building, and then the weapon stuff at the end of it. If they have access to the supply chain and they can see that Iran is not importing these things or making them themselves, you have now a very good possibility that you could detect a clandestine program, a secret program on the side, because it would only take a very small leak of information to turn the whole secret program topsy-turvy, set it on its ear. So I think that is one of the most significant things in the agreement and one that really pleased me.
So this is a big point you've mentioned to me off camera. You think the possibilities of a secret program, of course, nothing's ever impossible. On the other hand, there's never been any evidence, at least since 2003 and perhaps before, that there ever was an intent for a secret program. But you're saying under this regime, it would be almost impossible.
Well, I've been in the nuclear non-proliferation business now for years and years, and that's what you always worry about when you have your arms around the declared activities, when you have your arms around what you know is going on, and you feel that you have it completely boxed and safe, you have to worry about something going on in secret. But if you have your people, this regime they're talking about, looking at the supply chains for all these other things, And all you got to do is find certain valves, for example, that they might be buying from a foreign supplier, certain instrumentation, special materials that they might try to buy. Any one of those things could trip up the whole secret program. And so I'm not saying there is a secret program. I'm saying this is a very effective barrier to ensuring that there is not a secret program.
Okay, the next...
So, the beginning of the question you asked me a minute ago, you mentioned that they're going to have all this access. It's really nothing new. For the last 16 months, IAEA has been going to places like Fordo and Natanz on a daily basis. They've had excellent access to every declared nuclear facility in Iran, and I can't see anything in this agreement that's going to make that any better. It's already excellent.
And the point you're making is that the Iranians have allowed them that access, so there's reason to believe they would continue to do so.
Well, 16 months ago, they said they would do certain things, and I think we've heard from the president a few minutes ago, they did everything they said they'd do, and they're still doing it. So,
okay.
That's pretty good.
All right, we're going to keep working our way through the document here. Iran will be required to grant access to the IAEA to investigate suspicious sites or allegations of a covert enrichment facility, conversion facility, centrifuge production facility, or yellow cake production facility anywhere in the country.
That's part of the earlier paragraph. It's the same idea that if you're looking at all of the things that are required, and it's not just the centrifuge plant that makes a weapon, it's all of that chemistry and supply and mining and things. If they're looking at all of those things, they're going to have a good chance of detecting that, say, half the material you're looking at is disappearing somewhere else. So that's a very effective safeguard.
Okay, next one, and then I'm going to go back to the last one. Iran will implement an agreed set of measures to address the IAEA's concerns regarding the possible military dimensions, or PMD, of its program. If you put this together with the last one, anything suspicious, I mean, one of Iran's concerns for a long time in this inspections regime has been that the use of suspicious activity is used to actually go and look at what's going on the conventional weapons side. And I'm kind of surprised they've agreed to such language, because it now opens them up. Because now if they think it's not really nuclear suspicious, but IAEA wants to say it is, but it's really conventional, it's going to become a reason for sanctions to quote-unquote be snapped back. We're going to get into the details of snapback, but are you a little surprised how open they are on this language?
Well, I think that's the landmine in the agreement. That's a major problem in the agreement, because it's the only mention of PMD that I could find, possible military dimensions, in what's going to be looked into and taken care of. Now, the IAEA has completely blown their investigation on PMD. They've made a mess of it, and they've had years to look into many of the issues in PMD since, let's say, 2004, some of the first inspections, and certainly for the last 3 years, they've been claiming they have a lot of detailed information. They've made no progress. When they had the problem of dealing with Iraq, where they had 10 years or more of unfettered inspections going anywhere, anytime, much more severe than this agreement could possibly imagine, they still couldn't reach a conclusion on Iraq after 10 years. They still held out that, well, there are some things we don't completely understand, so we need to keep dragging our feet. Well, if IAEA drags their feet on this particular one, I believe the paragraph that you're quoting also says that the Security Council will remove those sanctions when IAEA is satisfied. That's a big red flag.
Because if the IAEA takes 10 years and no significant sanctions are lifted because of that,
exactly,
the deal blows up.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's saying, well, the sanction's going to be removed right away, right? And so that looks pretty good until you see this little buried sentence in there that says, when the IAEA is satisfied, then the Security Council can remove the sanctions. I think that's the warning bell, and somebody just needs to get in there and fix that little problem.
Well, in some ways, this all ends up being somewhat of a political question, does it? Like if somebody really wants the IAEA to drag its feet, it will drag its feet. That's someone more or less being the United States. If the United States really wants a deal, and at least this administration really wants a deal, but if the next one doesn't really want a deal, then they might be asking the IAEA to drag its feet. But I guess at this point, both sides need to take a next step.
The rumor mill that I listen to says that the U.S. government is trying to get IAEA quietly to remove itself from this PMD business, to just kind of let it fold. And if that's the case, you're right. This administration could maybe get the IAEA to, to quietly agree that they're satisfied, that they've heard things. And you're right. The next administration, if it's more hard line, could definitely use the IAEA as the spoiler.
But
IAEA was used as the spoiler in Iraq. Okay, the U.S. government would never allow the IAEA to say they were satisfied.
and this is the danger for the Iranians, that if they start taking some irreversible actions, like we're about to get into this, where they actually deconstruct the core of one of their main reactors, and then the next administration uses the language of the agreement to actually not lift sanctions, then Iran's given up a lot of leverage, perhaps for nothing.
Well, absolutely. And as I say, I read through the agreement, and that's a sentence that jumped out at me that maybe wasn't carefully crafted. And we have 3 more months before this whole thing gets cast in concrete anyway. I would think that it would be especially to Iran's interest to make sure that that sentence is modified, that sanctions don't depend on the IAEA being happy.
Okay, another big piece of the agreement follows. Iran has agreed to redesign and rebuild a heavy water research reactor in Arak, it's Arak, based on a design that is agreed to by the P5+1, which will not produce weapons-grade plutonium and which will support peaceful nuclear research and radioisotope production. The original core of the reactor, which would have enabled the production of significant quantities of weapons-grade plutonium, will be destroyed or removed from the country. Iran will ship all of its spent fuel from the reactor out of the country for the reactor's lifetime. That seems like a significant piece.
Wow, that whole section, when I read through it, is extremely good. I mean, they're saying they're going to take the Calandria, which is this vessel that would contain the heavy water and the natural fuel, and destroy it and replace it with a totally different kind of vessel that will have a different spacing and different neutronics, and you'll just get a lot less plutonium in the fuel. Then if you don't reprocess the fuel and you ship it out of the country, there's no problem whatsoever. That's beautiful, carefully crafted, excellent, open and shut case as far as I can see.
And in addition to that, there's the line, Iran will not build any additional heavy water reactors for 15 years. The next section is sanctions, and it's a little vague. The other stuff's rather specific, but what sanctions will be lifted, when sanctions will be lifted. The only thing that's really strong here is the following. Iran will receive sanctions relief if it verifiably abides by its commitments. U.S. and EU nuclear-related sanctions will be suspended after the IAEA has verified that Iran has taken all of its key nuclear-related steps. If at any time Iran fails to fulfill its commitments, these sanctions will snap back into place. The architecture of U.S. nuclear-related sanctions on Iran will be retained for much of the duration of the deal and allow for snapback of sanctions in the event of significant non-performance. So, I mean, I guess that's pretty straightforward in a sense, except we don't know what's being lifted and when, but Iran must have been given some kind of assurances, or they wouldn't agree to all this.
Well, similar to what we talked about in the military dimensions, IAEA has done an excellent job on the nuclear materials business for many, many years now, especially for the last 16 months under these daily inspections that they're conducting. So I think that you can believe that the IAEA will continue to say what it is saying about the nuclear materials business and about the joint agreement, the JPOA, that they're completely satisfied Iran has done everything they said they would do. State Department put out a flyer saying the same thing. So I think all of those things related to nuclear materials, to centrifuges, to building centrifuges, to mining, all of that stuff is pretty well covered right now. Pretty well covered, and I think IAEA can be counted upon to be very professional and complete in that area. It's the weapons area that worries me because that's so amorphous and outside their basic skills.
Goes on to say, U.S. sanctions on Iran for terrorism, human rights abuses, and ballistic missiles will remain in place under the deal. Previous section says important restrictions on conventional arms and ballistic missiles, as well as provisions that allow for related cargo inspections and asset freezes, will also be incorporated by this new resolution. I guess Iran has agreed to this, but these don't seem all directly connected to the nuclear issue at all.
Paul, I'm not an expert on those sanctions and what's in all of the sanctions passed by the Security Council. From what I can read in this, it sounds like they're just consolidating a number of previous resolutions, removing some things from Iran and consolidating the others. But that's not my area of expertise.
All right. In his comments in this statement, President Obama says if all these conditions are lived up to in this agreement, he says Iran can fully rejoin the community of nations. I guess that means these other sanctions too, one would think. At any rate, just to finalize, I think those are the big beats of this. Of course, this agreement's already being denounced by the Israeli government. The two big objections, one of which you've dealt with, that this doesn't preclude a secret program. You've said that to a large extent it does. The second objection that's being raised, I saw today, is that to enforce this, it really requires the Security Council. And the Russians may not want to enforce this. And what do you make of that? That the Russians could, in theory, veto some kind of, if the Americans or someone else or IAEA makes the argument that Iran's not living up to things, it may be hard to get a Security Council resolution to either snap back sanctions or such.
Well, again, that's a political science question. I think it's a very reasonable one. I think once sanctions are removed, they're very hard to put back, snap back or otherwise. And with a veto in the Security Council, yeah, that could happen. But again, that's not really my area of expertise. I've honed in on these paragraphs about the reactor and the enrichment and PMD, and in those areas, I would say that this is a surprisingly strong agreement, one that suggests to me that Iran has decided they really don't have anything to hide, and come on in and look around.
All right, thanks very much for joining us, Robert.
Nice to talk to you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.